if he gets 4 more years?
Sleepy Joe Biden.
It was all a lie.
He has no clue.
We're going to win 4 more years in the White House.
Vote, vote, vote.
Go out to vote. Go out to vote.
He's a fraud.
There's going to be fraud. Biden. Joe Biden went crazy.
Who the heck does he think he is?
Always known as a dumb guy. He's great. Oh, he's a beauty.
I want a safe America. Safe from 4 more years of Donald Trump.
Thank you. It's time to retire Joe Biden. This is serious stuff. Make America great again.
He's a left-wing
white
supremacist, radical left. Will you shut up, man?
Nothing if not entertaining, because it is many things. Paula has made her way down to the White House, joining us from inside the White House. And Anthony is from a fantastically state-of-the-art studio in New York City, also known as Anthony's house. I think Francois has made his way to the banks of the Seine, to the office of Le Journal du Dimanche. I had a quite amazing trip, crossing rivers and mountains and plains to coming to my office, which is about 10 yards away from the living room. Thanks to you all. Paula, we saw the debate. What was your key takeaway and why?
In the first couple minutes there, when former Vice President Joe Biden was giving his first answer, to be honest, he didn't look terribly impressive. He was slurring a bit. We don't see him nearly as often as we see President Trump. And sometimes when you see him in a still photo, it's an older photo. So I noted the people I was watching with, he looked older and perhaps not as with it as they had anticipated. And I looked at the president to see how he was going to play this. And he was reserved. He was quiet. He makes President stumble. And I said, wow, that's going to be a good strategy. If he just wants to allow the former vice president to make some gaffes, maybe commit to some policy positions he might regret, that's a great strategy. It lasted for about 4 minutes. And then we saw the president constantly interjecting, constantly interrupting, being very combative. And, even his closest advisors I've spoken with here, they don't think it went very well. In addition to the forced error over just an inability to condemn white supremacism, he also just missed an opportunity to allow potentially his rival to make those gaffes and to commit to policy positions. So it does appear that while the president is facing this really universal backlash from Republicans over his performance, it's just as much about the missed opportunity because he took this chaotic approach as it is about some of the unfavorable headlines coming out of that debate.
Anthony, you look at things from a slightly different perspective because you absolutely hone in on who says what, why, and then just that tiny sliver of the vote that they're trying to swing. So what is it that you took away mostly from Tuesday night?
So we did an instant reaction poll. We took a scientific sample of Americans who watched the debate, and we had set this up beforehand. So we had thousands and thousands of people who knew we were going to interview them right afterwards. And the results were striking, if not surprising. So 83% found the tone of the debate negative. But when we then asked them to use words to describe what they saw, the top answer was feeling annoyed. And that was far, far outdistanced speaking of sliver, the small number of people who said that they had felt informed. And the reaction we got out of that was, yes, that sort of encapsulates or it really captures the way people were feeling, which is always gratifying when you do a poll and it finds that resonance. It means that it was right. The who won question is almost besides the point because it very much reflected how the vote was going in. And that rather tells a story as well, which is that people's minds have largely been made up in this election for some time. We see near historic, if not historic levels of people saying that they are already strong supporters of their candidate and firm in that support. So when you talk about the sliver of people whose minds may not change or who are undecided, it's frankly not an election about that. It's really an election about who votes. And while there's the cliche here in U.S. politics about it all being about turnout, this time it really is true. And it's true for a couple of reasons. One is the one I just described, that people have already decided that certainly everyone has an opinion, both good and bad, about the president, and that it's very much a referendum, voters tell us, on his presidency. But the other reason for that, of course, is that we have so many different ways in which people can and may vote this year. We have a unprecedented number of people requesting to vote by mail because of the coronavirus. We have the real potential for polling places, the number of polling places, to be consolidated, to be changed, to be lessened, because they can't necessarily find enough poll workers amid a pandemic. All of that puts an enormous amount of uncertainty into how this process will take place. And so that is really what this is about.
Sorry, to be honest with you, I think the whole world is slightly nervous, not as nervous as you guys are, about what could happen because of those things. Can we just put the slide back up that we had on a minute ago, please, which is your CBS Tracker. Can you see that, Anthony? And if you can, could you just explain what we're looking at?
Sure. What we do this year is we have estimates from every one of our 50 states. And we do this not only because we think everyone should have a voice of some kind, but also because it's very important to remind the American audience that the way we elect a president is state by state. There is not a national popular vote, much though some polls only measure that. So we take every single one of the U.S. states and D.C., and we give them an estimate. It's actually something that we learned a lot from the UK elections and worked with some folks over there on how the models work. And what we do is we shade each of the U.S. states here. If they're white, they're pure toss-ups, they're even races. If they're shaded blue to some degree, they're leaning towards Joe Biden. And if they're shaded red to some degree, they're leaning towards Donald Trump.
Anthony, that's always given us Europeans a problem, because in our heads, red is socialist or communist, and blue are conservatives, and of course you've got it the other way around. So for us Europeans, you've always got to remember, it's the other way around. Red.
I inherited that color scheme. I have no idea why it landed that way.
I once looked into why, but I've forgotten it. But thanks for we're going to come back to all this sort of stuff and back to you, Paul. I just want to bring in Francois briefly, because you're going to do a lot more on the foreign policy later, Francois. You were 7 years in White House correspondent. I only made it in there a few times, but I remember going in once and asking only for an interview with, I think it was Bush's spokesperson. That's pretty down the peg. Well, it's fairly high up, but it's not the president. And the response was very simple. There's no votes in the UK. And then the guy walked off. Okay, so you and I don't get a vote, Francois. Our press here was universally hostile to the debate, appalled. What was the French media reaction to it? Not that it matters that much.
Well, in France and all over Europe, there was a big attention given to this debate. And the question is it or was it really a debate? Can you call it a debate? I mean, it was an absolute mess. It was like a wrestling ring. And frankly, as a journalist, I have to transfer some sympathy to Chris Wallace, because I think he did a pretty good job, because it was impossible to be like, a referee in this kind of game. As a former U.S. correspondent, as you said, I have covered 5 U.S. presidential elections. And frankly, I have never seen something like this debate, nothing at all. I mean, sometimes it can be harsh. But
that's what. And sorry, Francois, finish off. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I will say, just as a simple citizen from Europe and from France, that what we watched on this debate is not democracy as we practice it in Europe. And this is not America as we think we love America. So I think there is a huge deception about what we watched on the TV yesterday night.
Thank you, Francois. I'll come back to you soon. Francois had some sympathy for the moderator. I had some sympathy for you, Paula, a few months ago. That was an interesting debate you had with the president. Let's take a quick look at that.
Every Democrat thought I made a mistake when I did it. I saved tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of lives by hurting
time that you bought. The argument is that you bought yourself some time. You didn't use it to prepare hospitals. You didn't use it to ramp up testing. Right now,
you're so
20 million
disgraceful.
Unemployed.
It's so disgraceful the way you say that. Let me just listen. I just went over it.
Or this rant supposed to make people
I just went over it
in an unprecedented crisis.
Nobody thought we should do it, and when I did it.
But what did you do with the time that you bought?
You know
the
we
month
did?
of February. That
we did?
was a gap.
What do you do?
Month of February.
What do you do when you have no case in the whole United States?
You had cases
when
in February.
Excuse me, you reported it. 0 cases, 0 deaths on January 17th.
January. February, the entire
January.
month of
I said in January.
Your video has a complete gap.
On January 30th.
What did your administration do in February with the time that your travel ban bought
A lot. A lot. And in fact, we'll give you a list. What we did, in fact, part of it was up there. We did a lot. Look. You know you're a fake. You know that. Your whole network, the way you cover it, is fake. And most of you, and not all of you, but the people are wise to you. That's why you have a lower approval rating than you've ever had before, times probably 3.
Paula, leave personal opinions out of it, as you of course do. It's your job. I know what you're doing there. You're holding power to account. What's he doing there in that style vis-a-vis being re-elected?
Well, he was clearly caught, because the background on that is that they came out with this, there was a sizzle reel about everything they had done. And by that point, we had been dealing with the coronavirus for about 2.5 months, 3 months. And they came out with this sizzle reel of all the things that the administration had done during that time. But there was this obvious gap. It was an entire month, the month of February, that was just not in this video. And I think he was embarrassed by the fact that we called that out and pressed him. But the fact is, if you can't give me 1 or 2 concrete things you did in a pandemic in one of 3 months, that's hugely embarrassing for him. It was the fact that we called him out on the fact that they really did squander that time, even if they had bought some. And his way of dealing with that is to turn it around and try to attack. But most people see what did you do in February is not a gotcha question. So if he wants to try to undermine our integrity, attack the press, make it seem like he's held to a different standard, that we're not being fair to him, in some circumstances that works. Here, though, and I've had a lot of these interactions with the president, this time people could see that what did you do in February was not a gotcha question, and his answer, even though he didn't give us one, the personal attacks, I never got that list, by the way, that was an answer in and of itself. It's just they didn't do anything in February.
New Times. Anthony, I looked at your polling yesterday, and you may be aware, over here, the lead story when it comes to the States is the Black Lives Matter, the demonstrations, the rioting, and that dominates a lot of our coverage. But I noticed in your polling, it is secondary to the economy. And now I know it was Clinton that said it's the economy stupid, and that is a truism. But given the emotions of this year, did that surprise you? And just how much is it ahead of the demonstrations as the lead issue in the election?
I think for context, the demonstrations and the Black Lives Matter movement are enormously important and enormously influential in this election. The economy is almost the default #1 issue whenever you do a poll, or most times you do a poll. And that's often because both Democrats and Republicans agree on it. But the fact that the protests and the movement have risen to such a high level, even if not quite at the level of the economy, is quite striking. And it tells you in part where this country is, because you see the enormous divisions on it, which split by partisanship, where you see Republicans who tell us in very large numbers they disagree with the ideas of the movement. We follow up and we ask why, and they say that they see it as protests destroying property. They're focused on that aspect of it, whereas Democrats who largely agree with the ideas of the movement see it as people trying to bring change and raise awareness of racial discrimination. And it's an example of people here, both by their media consumption, but also by their own points of view, focusing on aspects of a particular set of events. And
okay, Anthony, I'm sorry to I've jumped in again, and we have a delay on the webinar, so forgive me. We're getting questions in from viewers now, so I wanted to junk some of my questions and go straight to them. And briefly, sure. There's one for each of you and Paula. From Rafael Hernandez, this one's to you, Anthony. Briefly, what are the key projections regarding the key swing states?
Well, I see that question, and it says that it works on a state-by-state basis. That is very much the point of what we are doing here. I have an estimate in every single state. So we're the ones doing polls in every single state. And the answer to that is that there are only a few states that are really toss-ups. Some are leaning towards Biden, some leaning towards Donald Trump. I think the ones you want to watch are Florida, are Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan. All of those, they're often battlegrounds, so we go over them every year. And that's where it is. The overall state of the race right now is Joe Biden is leading in enough battleground states, enough toss-up or swing states to have enough electoral votes. Having said that, that is not a forecast about what is going to happen, because as I said before, there is just so much uncertainty around who will actually cast a ballot this year.
Very, very briefly, you mentioned those 4 states. Are there any new ones that have come into play, swing states?
That's a wonderful question. The answer is yes. If you look across the South, I'd point you to, and it's obviously not it's a stylized U.S. map, but Arizona is one I point everybody to. It tells a story of how COVID and people's negative reaction to how the administration handled it has put new states that were formerly not battlegrounds in play. It's a story of a fast-growing state in the American Sun Belt, where both growing demographic change and shifting suburban votes have put states in play that were formerly Republican. So Arizona is the one I point to as a big, big story.
Thanks for the tip. Paula, you saw the format. Chris did, I wouldn't say he struggled, because it wasn't his fault that he got talked over so much by people that wouldn't necessarily listen to him. What do you think? Will there be changes to the format for the next 2 debates?
Well, certainly.
I should say the question from Andrew Clark. Thank you, Andrew.
Well, certainly Chris Wallace, one of the most experienced anchors, commentators we have, if he couldn't handle that format, clearly there need to be changes. And since these are going to be your 2 candidates for the next 2 presidential debates, the commission that handles these debates said, yes, they're going to make some changes. They'll be debating them over the next 48, 36 hours. They say at the top of their list is they want the ability to cut the microphones of the candidates so that they cannot interrupt each other and so they cannot interrupt the moderator. Now, the next debate we have is the vice presidential debate, but then after that we have another presidential debate, but it's going to be a town hall style. So just the format in and of itself may force the candidates to kind of rethink the constant interjections and interruptions, because it's quite different to try to talk over a Fox News host than it is to try to talk over, a little lady from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, or whoever these voters are going to be. So the format will change. That was always the design, but the actual mechanisms, they are going to make some changes. It's interesting, though, the 2 campaigns have responded to this, and they were both responded by just attacking one another. The president's campaign has suggested they're making these changes because, quote unquote, their guy, suggesting the commission supports Joe Biden, didn't do well. And then Joe Biden said he'll abide by whatever rules there are, and then just sort of attacked the president's debate performance. But I know many people were watching the other night, including my husband, just yelling like, why can't they cut their mics? That may or may not solve the problem that they had.
Yeah, I'd favour that. Can you imagine the retribution that they would try to mete out afterwards to you? We've still got time for, I think, 2 more questions for each of you. Let's go back to you quickly, Anthony. I want to play in one of the clips from Tuesday night's debate, because it plays into your findings about the economy. It's the one where Trump's tax came up, but it's important because it's not just about his tax. It's about how much tax ordinary people pay, which, of course, plays into our ideas about the economy.
Look, the tax code that made him, put him in a position that he pays less tax than a school teacher makes on the money a school teacher makes, is because of him he says he's smart because he can take advantage of the tax code. And he does take advantage of the tax code. That's why I'm going to eliminate the Trump tax cuts. And I'm going to eliminate those tax cuts and make sure that we invest in the people who, in fact, need the help. People out there need help.
But why didn't you do it over the last 25 years?
Because you weren't president. Because you weren't president screwing things up.
You were a senator. And
You're
by
the
way,
worst
you were
president America has ever had.
Hey,
Come
Joe,
on.
let me just tell you, Joe.
Well, leaving to one side Mr. Biden's straight, as we say, straight down the barrel, speaking to the American people, clear coaching. Anthony, a lot of people have picked that out as one of the key moments. Why?
Well, before even COVID and everything else, America was having an ongoing debate, not just about whether or not the economy works, but for whom it works. And we had seen an ongoing question of whether or not, as you have seen in Europe in many respects, in whether the economy was balanced, whether it gave everybody an opportunity. And voters in polls have increasingly told us within both parties that they were feeling that it did not. And so that has a certain resonance. That certainly has resonance here. That said, a lot of that debate this year has been overshadowed by strong group affiliations, not just by partisanship, but also by region. And those breaks are being emphasized as much, if not more, than the economic breaks that we often see.
Gotcha. I have an opportunity for you to give a yes or no answer, which is quite rare. This genuinely is a yes or no question. Richard Callan asks, if those who are angry with Trump are more likely to turn out and vote than swing Trump votes, who now may be anxious about the economy. So do you agree, is the question, that those who are angry with Trump are more likely to turn out, or the people that are anxious are more likely to turn out? So it's no longer a yes or no question. That's my fault for framing it like that. What's your response?
That's okay. That's okay. There are very few straight binary answers. There's a very, very clear and even motivation on each side of this. There is almost 9 in 10 of each candidate's supporters who say that they will turn out. Having said that, we do see in some states Democrats telling us that they find the process less easy than Republicans do. And maybe partly because they now have to navigate this mail voting process. And so I come back again to that great uncertainty in this race, which is the process of turning out.
Yeah, we're looking forward to that. And finally, before I'm going to ask you both to call the presidency, the result, not Pennsylvania Avenue. Paula, one of the also key clips was on the demonstrations. Biden actually name-checked the Proud Boys, which several of my colleagues and friends, including people in America, had never heard of. Let's quickly play in that clip, and I'd like to know from you, Paula, whether it was a mistake for him to name-check it, and how this is playing in the States. Let's just hear the clip.
But are you willing tonight to condemn white supremacists and militia groups and to say that they need to stand down and not add to the violence in a number of these cities, as we saw in Kenosha and as we've seen in Portland.
Sure,
Are you
I'm willing
prepared to
do
specifically
that, but
do it?
Well,
I
go
would
ahead,
say
sir.
I would say almost everything I see is from the left wing, not from the right wing.
So what are you saying?
I'm willing to do anything. I want to see
Well,
peace.
then do it, sir.
Say it. Do it. Say it.
Do you want to call him? What do you want to call him? Give me a name. Give me a
White
name. Go ahead.
supremacists and
Who would
white
you like me to condemn?
White supremacists and right-wing
Proud
militia.
Boys, stand back and stand by.
Paula, Proud Boys, have anyone heard of them?
I cover the White House. They have come up in terms of some of the unrest that we've seen in cities across the country. But you can't buy advertising like that. I mean, this audience is close to 100 million people. You know, everyone went to Google. Those groups are capitalizing on this. Not only did they get a shout out, but they also got what they interpreted to be as a call to arms from President Trump. So really, you know, docking points from both the moderator and President Trump. Of all the groups to name, he could have easily said, you know, the Ku Klux Klan or just the Unite the Right rally, use more of a symbol as opposed to, that was the name of the rally in Charlottesville in 2017, as opposed to calling out a single group. You have to know the power of the audience that you have. But of course, President Trump's answer was appalling. I mean, this is a softball question. His own FBI director said far right-wing extremism is one of the greatest threats currently facing the nation. And repeatedly, the president has had a very difficult time giving a sort of robust condemnation of white supremacy, which is surprising because he condemned pretty much everyone. I mean, I have heard him condemn windmills in more strong terms than he has white supremacy. And this is not a one-off. This is not just a bum-question.
Paula, we're all against windmills at some time in our lives.
It's very much a plea for President Trump. It's something he talks about at length at his rallies, windmills. It goes back to some litigation in his private business life. But the point is that when it comes to white supremacy, if this is one of the greatest potentially terrorist threats that the U.S. is facing, it should not be so hard for the president to clearly and concisely condemn it.
Okay, Mark Evans from ENEX asks if lasting damage, and this is what is concerning, I think, the democratic world. Has lasting damage been done to the democratic process in the States because of the political climate? Again, that's for you, Paula, because I know you've got to go in a couple of minutes.
Yeah. Look, let's go to the beginning of the beginning of his presidency. There were questions about whether he was working with a foreign government. That was, you know, very concerning that his campaign did not sort of follow the protocol that other campaigns that received foreign assistance had done and gone to the authorities. There were questions about that, but foreign interference in our elections is nothing new. And when it comes to the Trump administration and President Trump, yes, he routinely attacks the press, his own law enforcement. He continuously attacks all of these entities. He is in a perpetual state of sort of victimhood. So anything that happens to him, any investigation is unfair. It's a hoax. Even the pandemic, right, that happened to him, as opposed to saying, I'm the president, I take on this responsibility. Whether he's actually damaged democratic institutions, he is a symptom of some problems we have here in the U.S., particularly hyper-partisanship, racial tensions, economic disparity. I don't think he's the one who came in and caused all these problems, though he has added to them. But one good example of just the paradox, right? He rails against the press. I mean, you saw the personal attacks. We see the man every day. Almost every day, we have the opportunity to ask the president of the United States questions, not his spokesman, not his advisors, the president himself. He has just empirically granted an extraordinary amount of access to the free press, to the presidency, and that is a standard that whoever comes after him in a year, in 5 years, whatever it is, we're going to hold that president to the same standard. I wouldn't call it transparency, but I would call it direct access to the leader of the free world. So again, it's a paradox, and there are a lot of those in the Trump administration. It looks like he's trying to tear something down, but in his own weird way, he's just setting new standards.
Okay, I've got to let you both go. So a brief final question, answers back to back. Anthony and then Paula. As brief as you can, but I think we know the foreign policy which will happen in broad brush strokes if there is a second term for Mr. Trump. So tell me what a foreign policy looks like if it's going to be a Biden presidency. Anthony first, then Paula, back to back.
We haven't seen foreign policy really take a leading role here in Americans' decision-making process. You mentioned these other things, the economy. You mentioned the Black Lives Matter movement. We haven't seen a lot of discussion around it yet, perhaps because there's so many pressing things here at home. So in the minds of voters, which is my beat, I really haven't seen it rise to the top.
Thank you, Paula.
Under a Biden administration, you're not going to have the chummy overtures to North Korea, certainly not to Russia. But I think the adversarial relationship with China will continue. It just has to. The nature of our relationship, the things that are going on geopolitically in terms of intellectual property, obviously the fallout from the coronavirus. But I would expect that the vice president would travel quite a bit, sort of a goodwill tour across the globe. And I think there would be some changes, but I don't think it would be a dramatic overhaul.
Yeah, I particularly like your point about China, because, of course, there's a little adage, America has presidents and it has interests. The presidents change, but not all of the interests do. Paula, Anthony, I'm so grateful to you. I know, Paula, you've got to run off and track down the president from your state-of-the-art studio. Thank you so much for joining us. It's really great to get that level of insight from people that are closer than we can get. So thank you very much. This segues into more of the foreign policy, which is where Francois comes back in. Francois, picking up from that last answer from Paula, she did, that Congress is probably as possibly more aggressive towards China than the White House is. So do you see a sea change in American foreign policy if there is a Biden presidency?
Regarding China, I don't think so. I think that there is a bipartisanship about China, which exists in the US and which exists also in some ways in Europe. The very question for the Europeans is to adapt itself to what the US will do towards China. And this is the main difficulty for the Europeans. Do they have to stick to the US against China, regardless the policies or the practicality of it, or will Europe try to be in the middle and try to have its own policy regarding China? Is it possible? We have looked this recent month that France and Germany and Brussels, of course, with this new geopolitical commission with Ursula von der Leyen, try to create a doctrine to be not independent, but in the middle, not as a mediator. But we have so many grievances toward China, but we have also grievances to the US, and we would like to have an independent way of doing things towards China. And the real question is, will it be possible with Trump? I don't think so. With Biden? Maybe.
Okay, North Korea, you mentioned, Paula mentioned, there wouldn't be this cozying up. You could make the point that there was a time in the early days of his presidency where people were talking about war with North Korea, and it ended up with summitry. Now, Churchill, I think it was, jaw is better than war. So why wouldn't they, not necessarily cozy up, but why wouldn't a Biden presidency at least try to continue that dialogue?
Yeah, maybe yes. But the question for the Europeans is not to talk or not to talk with North Korea. The real question is about nuclear proliferation. And to this very aspect of nuclear proliferation, the main question is not North Korea, it's Iran. And is Joe Biden ready to come back into the JCPOA or not? And this will have a huge effect on what can we deal with North Korea, because it's exactly the same kind of problem. You can talk with North Korea, but the real question is, can North Korea dismantle the nuclear program? And this question is asked to Iran. There was a treaty. The US have gone on of the treaty. So is Biden ready? Has he have enough support in the Congress to do so? That's what the European would ask first.
Do you think the Europeans are, to a great extent, waiting for the result of the election before they make some strategic decisions? I mean, this isn't necessarily that strategic, but Nagorno-Karabakh, the flare-up of fighting there, for example, which does threaten to draw in Turkey and maybe Russia, I get the impression that the Europeans are just sort of, well, we don't really want to go there until the Americans signal an intention. Do you think that's true in the wider sense?
Yes, I think it's true. And it is every time the case, every 4 years, there is a sentiment that we have to wait a couple of months before things are decided in the US, before, having a policy where we can be much more closer to the US or much more independent to the US. And the result of the US presidential election is key for that. But I think that what happens in the US right now, on a very domestic point of view, what you said with Paula about, racism, the demonstrations, the riots, everything, and the populism that is going with Trump for 3.5 years right now, it has a huge foreign policy impact on Europe. Why? Because in Europe, since Trump has been elected, you have seen populism and far right much more having some ground in so many countries in Europe. And this is a real question for us. The impact of populism, demagoguery, the politicization of justice, the demonization of the press, the antagonization of the civil society, this has an impact on us. It had an impact in your country, in the UK, with the Brexit. It had an impact on so many Eastern countries like Hungary or Poland, in Italy as well. And it changed the way we are doing foreign policy. So you see that domestics and foreign are very much closer than expected, and that the Europeans have to take care of that.
I certainly agree with that. I think people, they underestimate the sort of ripple effect. I mean, you probably know the English expression, America sneezes, and certainly Britain catches a cold, and sometimes so does the mainland Europe. Put your White House hat back on. I know you were 7 years there, but you've been the editor of the paper for a few years now, because Alex Kengan asks, will Biden make the same mistake as Hillary and appear too confident before the actual vote?
Oh, this is a pretty good question. And yes, I mean, Hillary did this huge mistake not to go, in those swing states in the Midwest. And she thought that because of her name and because of her platform and because the polls were giving her, 5, 7, 8 points ahead, she thought it was a deal done. And that she didn't have to go and campaigning on these states. And it was a huge mistake. I remember the night, the electoral night 4 years ago, and I had the polls of the Democratic Party that was done few hours ago. And on each of these states in the Midwest, she was 5 to 8 points ahead. So yes, she could be confident, but you don't have to just rely on these polls. You have to campaign and to campaign again if you want to speak to those voters and to have their yes. So the circumstances are very, very different because of the COVID, but I think that Joe Biden won't make this mistake again. Never is given for granted.
Yeah, I remember covering one of the Israeli elections once, and Netanyahu was a blur of activity on the last day. And the opposition leader, forgive me for not remembering it, there was one photo of him and it was snatched through a window and he stayed in his house all day, and Netanyahu won by 1 point. And of course, the US election could come down to something as tight as that. Middle East. Let me introduce something which some people will find controversial, perhaps. The UAE and Israel, UAE, Bahrain and Israel deal. They've come to terms. They've come to peace. And Trump and his team are the biggest of the architects of that. I personally think that if this had been put together by the Obama administration, the networks in all the major countries would have had wall-to-wall coverage, and so including in France. They'd have, live of the planes arriving, live the signing ceremony we see here, etc., etc. But because of such a hostility for Trump for so many reasons, he really didn't get much coverage. Should the administration get more praise for putting together this deal, something that nobody else could manage?
Well, the reactions on the European side, in France, in the UK, in Germany, in all these huge capitals in Europe have been very good. I mean, they have acknowledged that it was a very good thing to bring these people together, these states together. But in the same time, they had to correct the record. I mean, Bahrain and the UAE weren't at war with Israel. They just normalized the relationship with Israel. It's not the same thing. I mean, it's not like with Egypt or it's not like with Jordan. These countries were at war with Israel. There was no peace. And they were very close to Israel. They were neighbors, which is not the case of the UAE and Bahrain. So it's two different things. It's very good to have people talking together, to have people exchanging ideas, and to have a normalization in the relationship. Now, do we have to praise President Trump for that? Perhaps yes. But in the same time, the Palestinian question is not resolved at all. And this is the key point. What are you doing to have peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians? This is a question of 40 years. It has never been resolved. We were very close with President Clinton. It was a failure. So what are you doing now? And the treaty, if you look at it, the treaty between UAE and Israel, there is not a single word about the Palestinian question. So we have, as Europeans, as neighbors, to put this question ahead and say to Mr. Biden, who applauded the agreement, what are you going to do now?
Okay, just to continue this before we then go broad brush, before we wrap up, Francois. You can make the argument, rightly or wrongly, that the Trump administration has actually read the future and realizes that the Palestinian question is no longer regarded in the Middle East as the key question. Now, that may not be a good thing for the Palestinians who remain in such a dire, terrible state, but the Trump administration appears to have just moved straight past them. And do you think a Biden administration will reverse any of that? Will move the embassy, for example?
No, Joe Biden has already said that he won't remove the embassy, but he said, and this is something very interesting because, you know, there was some talks between the center of the party and the left wing of the party, the Democratic Party, with the Sanders guys and the Warren guys to say, what can we do for the Palestinians in the coming years? And it's very difficult because the two positions are quite antagonized between the center and the left, but still, the Palestinian question has to be resolved. And the US is the only one broker in this story. Maybe the Europeans can help Biden to do something. Maybe the Arab countries that are favoring a solution can bring their input. But yes, right. Now, inside the Arab League, there is no unanimity to deal on the question of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. So this divide has helped Jared Kushner and Donald Trump to accentuate, you know, the normalization with some Arab countries in the Gulf. But we have to deal now to the question, the very central question, is it possible to leave Palestinians and Israelis for decades to come with nothing to talk about? They have to find a solution. And Joe Biden will have to answer this question one way or another.
Okay, which leads me to the last question on the broad brush. Talk us through briefly a Biden presidency or a second-term Trump presidency.
Well, obviously, I think that the Europeans, most of them, of course, will appreciate that we can change the tone and the core of the US foreign policy on so many aspects. We talk about China. We didn't talk about Europe. Obviously, Joe Biden likes Europe. He likes to talk with the Europeans. He likes to talk about the transatlantic alliance, and not on the same terms that Trump did in the previous years, you know, just talking about money, and that's it. And what's going on at the Russian border? What do we do with the threats? What do we do with reinforcing, you know, the burden sharing between the Europeans? It's not just a financial question. It's a question of principles. It's a question of how do you deal with your allies? Are you treating them as if they were just, you know, some bad guys that have to pay before have a word? Or are they people who you can talk to because sometimes you will need them and sometimes you won't? And if you won't, maybe they can have, you know, a kind of strategic autonomy. This is the real question for the Europeans. Is it possible with Biden to accentuate and to highlight what we want now in Europe, and because there is a consensus about it, to have a much more autonomous, independent strategy to deal with the rest of the world, and mainly with our neighbors, Russia, Turkey, the Mediterranean, and North Africa and the Sahel. Is it possible that the Europeans can deal with that, having the US backing what we decide, not what we decide together? And I think Joe Biden is much more prepared to have this debate with the Europeans than is Donald Trump, because these 4 recent years, Trump didn't go in that direction.
That's nicely rounded up. Thank you, Francois. Yes, I mean, it's not just about tone, is it? It's tone and decision making, and on both of those things, yes, a Biden presidency will look very different to a second-term Trump presidency. Francois, thank you for that European perspective, and also, of course, your expertise given your years at the White House. Anthony and Paula have gone, but belated thanks again to them. Thanks to ENEX for putting this on. This was the first ENEX webinar. Not going to be the last. There is another one. There's going to be a webinar coming up later this year. I think Luxembourg, ENEX headquarters, is, they're debating what to do. Are you still there, my former boss at Sky News?
Yeah, let me help you out a bit with that, Tim. Yeah, we're gonna do a few more of these webinars because obviously we found it very difficult to do our normal meetings during the travel restrictions that we're all suffering. And we're trying to pick stories that we think will be of interest to people, have wide appeal. This one was the easiest decision to make. The US elections, you know, just a few weeks away, and a massive interest from everyone about what's going to happen. So that was pretty easy. And I think in a way, the next subject we're planning to do is also an easy one. And that is that we're going to focus on climate change, which, if we remember, was the really big story before we had COVID-19 on our doorsteps. So we're going to come back to climate change. We're going to look at that. We're going to look about sustainability. And the intersection with the pandemic as well, because in a way we do see a connection there, because if you like, life has changed and sustainability itself has been accelerated by some of the things that we've had to cope with, given that we've been living with a global pandemic. So we're looking at all those things: climate, sustainability, and the effect of living in a post-pandemic world. We'll have some very special guests from Cambridge University. We have a professor from South Africa on the same subject. It will be hosted by one of the people who asked the question today, who's himself a professor from South African University in Cape Town, Richard Calland. And that will be later this month. We haven't got a precise date for it, but we'll be killing you with lots of marketing in the course of the next few weeks. So no one will be under any doubt of when that will be. And thank you for you, Tim, for hosting the session so well. Thank you to Francois for joining us from Paris. It's great to have got the first one underway and complete so successfully. And it's goodbye from the Luxembourg jury. And Tim, I'll leave you to say your goodbyes too.
That's kind. Thank you, Adrian. Thanks everyone for watching. Thanks for the questions. Also, if you came in late, or if you want to see it again, or want to send it off to somebody, it has all been recorded. And it'll pop up online in various places. So thanks again to everybody. Thanks to ENEX for inviting me on. And I hope you can join these guys for the next one sometime later this month. Bye-bye.